So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us for our second ChildNEXUS Live. Today I am so delighted to have a discussion with Dr. Bibi Pirayesh, who is an educational therapist and founder of The Learning Tree. My name is Dr. Karen Wilson. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist and founder of ChildNEXUS.com. And you know, Dr. Pirayesh and I have had discussions before, and we just thought it would be important at this time to have a discussion on how to support students during this time of distance learning. A couple of weeks ago, we kind of approached this topic with Dr. Stephanie Mihalis from a social and emotional standpoint, but I've been getting a lot of parents who are really concerned about their students and their children regressing during this time of distance learning, particularly those students who've had difficulties prior to the stay-at-home order. So I wanted to just open it up, Dr. Pirayesh, and have a discussion and answer questions that people might have during this time about how worried should parents be about their kids regressing during this time. And then, as we continue this discussion, how do we support them as we move forward and finish out the end of this academic year and start planning for summer and beyond?
Yes, well, thank you, Karen, so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and excited to talk about this topic because I know that it's something that a lot of us who are kind of in the field, we're getting a lot of questions about it. And of course, I think this is a time of just general anxiety, even outside of all this. It's a little bit of an anxious time. And then, of course, when it comes to what's going on with children, a lot of parents are anxious about things like, well, how much are they really learning? What are they missing? What's going to happen, etc. So I think it's important that we're talking about it. And I usually like to start by reminding everyone that things work best when we don't come to it from a place of anxiety and worry. And one of the things that I've been talking to a lot of families about is to just try to kind of pull the lens back and think about how this is, yes, it's difficult. Yes, we're still in the unknown. We don't know how long this is going to take. But so far, anyway, we're talking about 2 to 3 months outside or within a 12 or more year academic career. And even though it is important that we are smart and proactive, I don't want parents to think that, oh my God, this is going to make or break my child and their ability to be successful. It's not. It's simply not. So keep that in mind, I think, is really important, is that even though it feels like the last 2 months have felt like 2 years, it's still been a relatively short amount of time. And in the big picture, we don't need to worry that much. Now, I know that a lot of people are thinking, well, what's going to happen next year? And there's been some rumblings and talk about possibly, the virtual schooling continuing on in the fall. And, that's something that we need to talk about and address. But generally speaking, the general question of how worried should we be? My answer to that is, don't worry, it's going to be okay. We're going through, so far, I don't know about you, but I am just blown away by how everyone has been able to step up to the plate in their own sort of capacities and abilities, whether they're parents or teachers or professionals or the students themselves. And we did switch to virtual learning, and we are finishing out the school year without any warning. And we've survived it, or we are surviving it, and we're going to survive it. So I think that we need to trust in our own abilities, believe in the fact that we'll be able to handle this. And so just generally, I would say, don't worry too much. But then, of course, there are things that we do need to be thoughtful of and proactive about. And of course, we'll talk more about that.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point about the fact that this is 2 to 3 months out of years of academic experience, correct?
Right. And also, this is not something that, it might be very new to some people, but in the history of schooling or it's not an unprecedented thing. People all over the world, kids all over the world miss school because of different reasons: war, immigration, all kinds of reasons for large periods of time, and are generally able to make up that time and come back from it. So, we don't necessarily hear stories of, oh, I just became a failure in life because I missed, 6 months of school or something. So I think that it's really easy right now, just because we're in this unknown place, to fall into that doom and gloom thinking.
Mhm.
But generally speaking, we're okay, and we're going to be okay.
Absolutely. And I just want to mention too that we really want to hear from everyone who's on this call and who's watching and listening. We want your questions. So feel free to add your questions to the chat, and we will answer them live right here, so you can have some answers to your questions or comments on what it is that we're discussing and talking about at this time. So I think that you've really framed this experience that we're having in a very positive and optimistic way. And we also know that kids before COVID-19 had their own differences in terms of their ability level and their struggles. And some parents feel like, this has just been exacerbated by this distance learning experience. On the other hand, there are parents whose kids had some struggles, and now they're actually doing better in a distance learning environment, either because there are fewer distractions, they can really focus, they have a parent who can sit beside them while they're doing the work, so they have more one-on-one instruction. And so I think one of the things to point to is that not everybody is going to fall through the cracks. And some people will actually thrive from this mode of instruction. And we just have to be paying attention to how they're doing and having open lines of communication with teachers and educators in terms of how students are responding to this transition to distance learning.
Absolutely. This is something that we've been, talking about in the community a lot recently, because obviously, when you go through times like this, it's oftentimes the people that were already vulnerable that are becoming even more vulnerable. And this is not limited to education. We're seeing it across the board in terms of health, economic issues, etc. So obviously that's a reality that we all have to contend with. At the same time, a lot of us in the field have been talking about what an incredibly precious and important time this has been for those of us who want to learn more about what students' learning needs are. And I did a webinar a few weeks back on executive functioning and helping kids with executive functioning difficulties during the virtual schooling. And, it's exactly like you said, we're finding that certain aspects of it are very difficult. For example, the virtual part of it can be very difficult because, as we know, atypically, all kids learn better when they are able to have a multisensory approach. And one of the things that virtual learning does is that it disconnects almost the mind from the body. And so we're not able to engage and to learn with our bodies in the same way that we would, normally. And, there's been a lot of discussion about why we have Zoom fatigue and why that's really difficult, etc. So all of that is true. But then at the same time, this has really been this incredible experience for parents to really get to observe and understand their children's learning needs in ways that they never would have before. They suddenly have this window into their lives, and they're in the middle of it with them and with teachers. And we always say that the best executive function training happens in the home, because it really is a system-wide issue. And so for those of us who do executive function work, we always do go into the home because it's really important to set up those systems, etc. And so we already have that piece, and that's really important. Then at the same time, I think that this has been a very interesting time in getting, I've always said that if you really want to learn, and we know this in any kind of scientific process, if you want to understand how a process works, you want to look at it where it breaks down. And so that has always been one of the great gifts of children with different types of learning disabilities or atypical learning styles, etc., to the general population. And I think that this time has really allowed for us to learn even more about education and about learning because of the experiences that a lot of these students are having. So, one thing that, for example, I have always been an advocate of when working with family or when working with schools is, well, can we do self-paced learning? If this particular student can't keep up with everybody else at that pace, we need to figure out a different pace. Or when we talk, whether it's around IEPs, et cetera, and we're talking about modifications and accommodations, suddenly we're in a time now when teachers and schools are a lot more open to the idea of providing these kinds of differentiated learning. And that has been huge. And I think that teachers are beginning to see that when they allow for this, kids are able to do the work, they are able to deliver, they are able to learn. And so these are great and important lessons that we can then later on take and use to advocate for our kids. But things like, for a lot of executive function kids, just having all the information written down somewhere in the ways that teachers are now doing is hugely important. Being able to ask teachers, can you pare this down? Like, we're not going to be able to get to every single aspect of this. What are the 3 most important things? And teachers are a lot more willing to do that right now. They want to do that right now because they're finding themselves in a difficult position of not really being able to deliver their curriculum in the same way. So they're looking to see what the important aspects and factors are and making sure that kids walk away from those. And all of these things are principles and lessons and practices that I think are really important for kids who are atypical. And my hope is that now that we've all been through this as a community together, the conversations are going to shift. And when we go back and we are ready to go back to IEP meetings and to advocate for our students again, I'm hopeful that we're going to get a different kind of school professional on the other side of the table, because they will now, as a result of this time, have a much deeper understanding of what a lot of these struggles are. Because I think in a way we're all in a time right now where we have almost like global ADHD. All of us are really struggling with these things. And so I'm in those aspects, I'm very hopeful about this time.
Yes. And I think that one of the things you said that was so important is really about parents being in the position to now observe their kids as they're completing tasks in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise, because they're not in the classroom for the most part. Mm-hmm. And then again, we get back to the idea of communicating those observations to the teacher to find out what it is that we need to prioritize. What is the goal of this particular learning activity, right? And how can we achieve that goal in a different way if the way it's being presented or the expectations are not working for my child in the way he learns or the way he's kind of functioning at this time during this time of distance learning. So I think that's an important point as well.
Exactly.
And so we have a question here. Someone has asked, April has asked, how would you recommend motivating a child who feels overwhelmed by working independently?
Yes. Well, so I think that is another kind of important aspect of this that we need to address. There is now the expectation that kids are working a lot more independently than they would otherwise. And that just doesn't work for a lot of students. And so for better or worse, the parents are having to step in as kind of the middle person who takes what is coming from the school, going through and breaking it down into manageable parts, and then presenting that to the student in a way that they can actually meet those goals. So as an educational therapist, for example, that's always been a big part of what I do, but I'm finding that to be even more the case right now, because there isn't necessarily for every student classroom time where they're having exposure to a lot of this material. And what happens is you do get this like long list. I mean, different teachers are doing it differently, but some teachers just send a long, 50-step list of all the things that a student needs to do. And we know for our students who struggle with that, just looking at that list is going to make them completely shut down. And so that is the place where I think that, you know, if you have access to a professional who can help you, well, obviously that's ideal. But if not, then that's really the place where the parent needs to step in and, you know, go through and figure out what are the things that, and you know, map it out then into like lists and priorities and calendars. And, you know, we talked about all of that in great detail, for example, on the webinar that I mentioned. But to really be the in-between communicator, because a lot of times what happens for students, and I'm seeing this with a lot of my clients right now, when they're presented with information that their brain can't quite process, they simply shut down. And it's that shutting down that then presents itself as, oh, he's being lazy, or she's not really doing the work, or procrastinating, or not motivated. I don't see it as any of those, or as a motivation issue. I think that all of us, when we're presented with a task that we understand what is expected of us, and we know there's a little bit of challenge in it, and there's a beginning, middle, and end, and we're clear on what we need to do, we can step up to the plate and do that. Now, for a lot of our atypical kids, that can be very difficult, and teachers don't necessarily understand that, and they're under a lot of pressure right now. So that really has to be the place where another person needs to step in and be the middleman or woman.
And I think too, oftentimes when you talked about feeling overwhelmed, you know, that's where mindset comes in, where kids might think, this is just too much. There's no way that I can do this. And parents have to kind of, like you said, step in, and it may be, you know, breaking up this task into smaller chunks, like you were saying, but also to work with this child on their mindset. You know, it does seem overwhelming. Let's empathize. Let's meet them where they are. And let's just take a piece of this and work on this right now. We'll worry about the rest later, which decreases the feelings of overwhelm if we're just taking this small piece. And I also think that kids need much more breaks now than they did in a classroom setting. Because when they were in the classroom, they may have been working side by side with a peer, and they're sharing their ideas. I'm writing about this. What are you writing about? Or I'm going to add this. And they lose that camaraderie with their peers, and working independently can be very isolating and feel very lonely, and also feel very overwhelming. And so I think we have to be attuned to those feelings that the child is experiencing and give more breaks as necessary, right? Let's work on this for 10 minutes, and then we're going to go outside. We're going to grab a snack. We're going to, you know, talk about something else. We're going to go jump rope. We're going to shoot some baskets. We're going to go for a small walk around the block, breaking those tasks up in a way that you wouldn't normally do in a regular academic setting.
Absolutely. And, you know, you're pointing to something that I think is really important, which is that connection piece. I think that what we're missing now more than before is, like you said, when a student is in class, they can have that connection with a peer, they can have that connection with their teacher. If they don't like a teacher, there might be another teacher, whereas now none of that exists. And so, I mean, it is in some ways a burden, but in other ways it can be a gift. But that's why I think the role that parents are playing right now, more just in kind of creating that connection and letting them know that they're there for them and reassuring them, that's going to go a much longer way in helping with that motivation piece, I think, than anything else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some parents, you know, who might be seeing their kids struggle during this time, maybe they're seeing this for the first time, are thinking and considering extending distance learning into the summer, right? So after the school says, okay, we're done, you're off for the summer, some parents think, I'm still worried about my child regressing. I don't feel like they got everything from the distance learning experience. Perhaps I should extend and create my own distance learning experience for them through the summer. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot out there right now, a lot of questions and opinions about what needs to get done in the summer. And, you know, I read something in the Washington Post the other day about, you know, this education catastrophe and, you know, what are we going to do? And there are districts that are talking about having mandatory summer school. And then there's people who are talking about extending the school year or starting it really super early in order to make up for all this time. And I just don't in general agree with any of that. I think that this was a time that we had to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Kids are going to need a break, parents are going to need a break, and teachers are going to need a break.
Mm-hmm.
And we forget because we've been sort of living these really fast-paced lives for quite some time now. And one of the things that this whole crisis has really forced us to do is to slow down. But it used to be that the summer was a time where you really allowed your brain time to marinate, to get bored, to do nothing, to be creative, to read, to reflect. And I don't necessarily think that it's a good idea to try to just fill kids' day with like Zoom sessions and this class and that class and this group and that group. I do think it's really important that people familiarize themselves with some of the science behind the Zoom fatigue, because I think one of the things that happens in response to the anxiety about missing school is to try to just replicate it
Mm-hmm.
virtually. And I think that there's so much that happens to the brain when you have to interface in a virtual setting,
Yes.
that is really not good for you. And so I don't think that just trying to fill, because I know a lot of parents are worried about, well, we can't go outside, what are we supposed to do, I have to have them busy and they have to be working on something productive. I really think that this is yet another opportunity for us to learn from sort of what those of us who've been in the sort of learning disability world a long time know, which is that a little bit of really intense explicit instruction is going to go a much longer way than spending 6 hours in kind of connected, kind of not. And so I would say that we should spend the summer actually resting and remembering that it's in that rest time that a lot of our learning actually happens. But of course, I'm also aware of, a lot of people have been citing all the research on the summer slide, and, maybe we need to go to that research to figure out what we need to do this summer. And, I always found that research to be a little bit controversial anyway. But it's not, I don't want to say, I mean, for the types of students that I see, I do for all of them recommend that they continue to do some work over the summer. So I'm not saying just check out completely and you do nothing and you come back and you expect that there's no regression at all. However, I think that should be something that is really well thought out, that is very targeted and based on that particular student's needs, and thoughtful, and in a much more compact package than we would expect. So for a lot of my students, I mean, again, depending, because we know that the summer slide, for example, in math tends to have much lower numbers than in other areas. So, if a student is doing 15 minutes of math work a day over the summer, that's sufficient. For a lot of students, that's sufficient. Just to sort of keep their skills sharp. My recommendation for a lot of my students is some kind of processing skills program over the summer, because really working at the underlying skills can be more important. The content you can always learn. Of course, there's variability in terms of where you are in your education. So obviously, if you're a high school student and you need to learn your AP chemistry content because you're going to have a test, that's a different topic. But generally, I think really trying to do more targeted work where you're working on the underlying learning skills can be helpful, and not as time consuming, and it won't feel like academics. And that's really important too, because kids they're spent right now. And I think that tending to their mental health is going to be a lot more important over the summer than anything else.
Yeah, I think those are really great points. And I think we come back to communicating with educators in terms of how is my child doing and where are the gaps? Is there any area where we need to focus over the summer? And then you as a parent decide what that focus will look like. right? What that will look like. And it sounds like what you're saying is rather than doing, you know, a 4-hour a day, you know, tutoring program, that really small chunks of time, maybe with the support of an educational therapist, would be more beneficial than having them continue on this distance learning trajectory over the summer. And it sounds like they really do need a break.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, every child is going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this rush that we're seeing right now, where everyone's like, I got to get my kid into this program or to this camp or virtual tech camp, and we're going to just plop them in front of a computer again for hours on end. I don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, and I think it's true that the brain needs a break, particularly from spending all of this time focusing and at screens, whether it be a tablet or a computer over an extended period of time. The students do need a break from it. They do need a break. And learning doesn't always take place, and a lot of learning doesn't take place via traditional methods, right? And you talked about the summer. The summer is usually a time when young children play, right? And there's a lot of research behind the learning that takes place during play, right? The problem solving, the back and forth, the being in tune to the expectations of others and figuring things out. So there are other ways for children to learn and continue to build on their skills that doesn't involve a Zoom session.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that so much learning even for older kids happens in figuring out, social interactions. It happens in, we're in such a unique time right now. I think it would be a lot more interesting, for example, to try to engage our children in deep and meaningful ways, to have them kind of think about and reflect on what it is that we're going through right now, or to give them an opportunity. If you can do, deep reading of a few books over the summer, you are hitting so many important skills, and you're engaging with your child. That to me is a lot more valuable than having your kid in 100 different classes.
Absolutely. And if you can co-read that book with your child, that's even better, because then you can have a discussion about it over the dinner table and, exchange ideas and thoughts about different aspects of the book, which further enhances, comprehension and things like that. And I think the same is true for even writing. How can we build on our writing skills over the summer in a way that doesn't feel like we're extending distance learning? It might be, I can't see grandma right now. Let's write her a letter and tell her what we've been doing or what our plans are for the summer. Or let's write a letter to the frontline workers, thanking them for the work that they're doing. So there's a lot of ways we can get at those underlying skills in a way that doesn't feel like a continuation of the academic curriculum.
Absolutely. I do want to add one kind of little thing to that. There are those students who, so for example, if you had a student who has a reading, an auditory processing issue or a reading disability, and your thought was, okay, well, this is a short-term thing. I'm just going to wait out this 2 months, and we're not necessarily going to get any intervention or, anything like that, and we're just going to wait it out. Now you're at the beginning of the summer, and you're thinking, okay, well, am I going to have to now extend this even longer? So for cases like that, I would say, no, let's try to, and there's so many resources and there's so many people who are actually very good at providing that type of instruction virtually. So in cases like that, I would say address that. But generally speaking, that's not the same as putting your kid in, a 4-hour a day Zoom program.
Absolutely. And I think that is actually directly addressing the question from Nicole Michaeli. And the question was thoughts on virtual educational therapy. And I think that really speaks to the idea that some kids need additional support, particularly when there's an underlying learning or processing issue that impacts their functioning. And those kids, and we know from the research, are at greater risk for regression, particularly when there are long breaks, when they're not getting intervention. And perhaps maybe you can talk about, for those on the call who don't know what educational therapy is, what that looks like for kids who are struggling with learning or processing issues, and to answer the question, can it be done virtually? in short bursts over the summer.
Sure. So just kind of very quickly overview what educational therapy is. An educational therapist is a person who is specifically trained to work with students with different kinds of learning profiles and learning needs. I personally, as an educational therapist, I'm a big believer in remediation. And so my approach tends to be very remediation based. However, over the last, couple months, I have to be honest that, and this isn't something that's even unique to educational therapists. I know a lot of therapists, like mental health professionals, who've also suddenly found themselves becoming executive function coaches. And so a lot of us have turned to just helping the kids get through this time. And so work that was, true educational therapy, where we're working on remediating skills, was put on hold. For a lot of my students, that was actually my recommendation, because there was just no way to do it all and get the kids through. But now that it's the summer, if it's actually true and we hopefully don't have some mandatory summer school, I do think that this could be a time to now try to return to some of that remediation work. However, I think it's really important that you are connecting with people who are comfortable doing that virtually. There are some really great people who were doing virtual educational therapy before even all of this happened. So if the question is it possible to do it? It is possible to do it. Is it as good as it would be in person? No, not necessarily. Obviously, we know that everything is somewhere around the 70% mark. If you're doing it really well virtually too. But a 70% mark is a lot better than zero. So especially for kids, who, and this is, I think, really important in reading, because the more you prolong and you don't remediate the learning difficulties, the worse. So educational therapy is possible. It will need the involvement and engagement of parents in more ways than it would otherwise. But that is something that, again, depending on that particular student, I do think that that's something that parents can do over the summer.
Right. And really, when you're talking about educational therapy, you're really talking about addressing, again, those underlying issues that lead to the difficulties that parents and educators see. And so when I think about kids who struggle with reading or the phonological processing, and some of those students are diagnosed with a dyslexia, it's really differences from the research is showing us. It's a difference in the way their brains are wired. And the exciting thing about the educational therapy and the work that you and others do is that when we intervene and target those underlying pathways in a multimodal way, the students not only improve their reading, but we actually change the way their brains are wired so that those pathways become more efficient. And so students make a bigger leap and a more efficient leap from learning to read to reading to learn, which is ultimately what we want them to do.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the business of educational therapy. It's the rewiring of the brain so that students are using the most efficient pathways. It is something that happens best when it's multimodal. And of course, we're a little bit limited in that regard right now, but it's still absolutely possible. And people are doing it. I'm doing it. And we're seeing results. So we continue to see results. But, I think that it's really important, and to sort of come back to, obviously, the work that you do, Karen, it's really important that we are clear on what the students' actual needs are so that we can give them targeted instruction, as opposed to just plopping them into like a Kumon type class and hoping that they figure it out. One thing that I've also been hearing that is really worrisome for me is I'm hearing talk of some people saying, oh, well, let's just have students repeat the school year. And I think, and this is something that we sometimes also hear for students who are different learners. And it's important that we remember that if it didn't work the first time around, it's not going to work the second time around. You're just wasting your time and you're creating all this other stigma and shame around being held back. So I think it's really important that we use the knowledge base that we have about how learning works to make our decisions about what we do in terms of schooling now. So repeating, doing the same thing for a longer period of time is not going to help. You have to do it differently. And that's where really trying to assess what's going on and diagnose and then intervene becomes really important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a lot of that research has also been seen with parents who redshirt their kids and hold them back because they seem like they're not ready to start kindergarten. And what the research shows is that if you intervene and give them the support that they need, that they really can thrive, as opposed to holding them back a year and waiting for them to catch up.
Absolutely. Yeah. Doing the same thing longer is not going to make a difference.
Right. Yeah. So I really want to encourage any questions that individuals on the call might have. We've answered a couple, but we are here and available to answer any more questions that people might have as they're thinking about supporting their kids or their students as they get ready to transition, because the school year is almost over. Get ready to transition to ending the school year and then determining what to do for summer, particularly since a lot of camps have now been canceled for kids for summer. So parents are trying to figure out what to do. But I love the idea of taking that time to really connect with your child. And there's a lot of research on connection and how it enhances not only learning, but overall well-being, of a child and of a family. And using this time right now and seeing some of this time that we have, that we didn't have before, as really a gift and as an opportunity to grow and learn about our kids.
Yeah, and I just want to say sort of one additional thing around this idea of connection. So I know that there's some kids who had, were in ed therapy or had OT or they had, therapy, whatever these things were. And then for different reasons, whether it's economic reasons or others, parents have decided to maybe cut back on some of that stuff. And that's completely understandable. And obviously every family has to make their own decision. But one thing that I do recommend, just one, to help with that connection piece, and two, to continue to keep up with some sense of normalcy for kids, is just seeing about possibly just checking in with the professionals that you had maybe working with your children over the summer. You can set up maybe 3 check-ins. And that, just being able to check in and see how things are going, or maybe asking them to give you something that you can do with them, if financial things are an issue, and then setting some milestones where you check in, something like that. I mean, we have to all be very creative right now, I think, and most people are willing to be creative. So I just want to also make sure that, because I know that it can be economically really difficult for some families, I want to make sure that you don't think that, oh, well, I can't afford this right now, so I just have to cut everything.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of good resources that have become available online where before there was a charge associated with it, but now there isn't, given the health crisis that we're in. Someone asked a question about recommendations for kids in dual language programs. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I think, again, if we think about exposure is really key. If the parents are not fluent in that target language, then we want to, again, expose them as much as possible to that other language they're learning. But again, don't feel the need to replicate the school environment, because over the summer, they would have not had that experience anyway, right? Unless they were doing a dual language summer school. And so get tips from the teachers in terms of what they can do. They maybe continue reading in that second language, doing reading and doing audiobooks so that they're exposed, maybe watching some television programs in that other target language. Those are ways to kind of keep it active in their brains. But what we know about the brains is that they're very plastic, they're very amenable. So even a short break won't mean that they're going to lose those skills that they've been building over time. They will pick them up. Kids are profoundly resilient, and their brains are already pre-wired, and that strength and those pathways are there. They've been laid down, and they will continue to jump on those pathways, and they will continue to connect with each other once they get re-exposed to that dual language.
Absolutely. And I think, something like language, I mean, this could be an opportunity to do some really, really fun things. Mm-hmm. I think engaging the student and asking them what they would like to do, what are different ways that they would like to continue to, get exposure or work on, their language. I mean, this is, one of the really fascinating things about what we're going through right now is that it's a global phenomenon. So everyone everywhere is dealing with this. And it could be a really, exciting time to try to connect with people in other parts of the world who speak the language that you're interested in learning. I mean, there's all kinds of fun things that you could do about it. And I think that engaging the child in the conversation and trying to come up with creative different things that you can do together, I mean, that is really what a summer is meant to be for. So I think that turning our attention and trying to do that, again, is better than panicking and trying to do everything.
Absolutely. And there are a lot, I love the way you talked about it globally, because, this is a time where a lot of families would go on vacations to different parts of the world, and they're not doing that now because of this crisis. But a lot of museums and, other kind of places have opened up virtual kind of opportunities for people to go and visit those places. So, if you're studying French or you're studying Spanish and that's the dual language, then you can go to these museums in other parts of the world and get guided tours in that target language. So there are a lot of ways, fun ways, to continue with that learning in another language.
Absolutely. And because we're sort of in this global pandemic together, I think it's a time where people are really are really open. They want to hear about and from others. They want to share, they want to connect. So I think reaching out, so for example, if you're doing something with one of the museums, so many museums have incredible educational resources. And they would love the opportunity to kind of connect with kids and help them come up with something that they can do over the summer. So it's also a time to really encourage our children to initiate things on their own, because the world is going to be a lot more responsive to them now than it would be otherwise. And I think that they might be surprised after they get back.
Yes, I agree. So as we're kind of moving and preparing for summer, when I think about summer, I think now is just a great time, again, for connection, like we've been talking about, but also an opportunity to really build resilience in our kids, right? This has been a challenging situation. Kids learn by watching us and what we do and how we respond to situations. And we've been modeling how to respond this whole time. And they've been watching us very closely, right? Mm-hmm. And we can continue to build that resilience by continuing discussions, by talking out loud, our problem solving, thoughts, things that we would usually kind of process in our heads. We now are thinking them out loud. We were going to go on vacation, but we can't do that. What are some other things that we can do over the summer that might be fun, and engage in that discussion and get ideas out there? And then if an idea is something that typically would not work right now, well, let's talk about why that wouldn't work. So it provides an opportunity to problem solve, right? And again, we talk about using the opportunity to build resilience and to continue building skills. Problem solving is an important skill.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to, for me, I've been really, really surprised by the resiliency that I see in the children that I work with. And I get some of my best ideas from the conversations that I have with them. I think oftentimes, when you first approach kids, they can be kind of like, no, stand up. But if you continue to engage, they engage back and they come up with some really, really cool things. And like you said, problem solving together, it is a time where we can really help them see how important a part of the conversation they are, because we're all building this and figuring it out as we go. It's not like we have this set way in the world that we're just going to have them follow. So I think in that sense too, it's a real opportunity to engage with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even though we're preparing for the next academic year and we want to not have a free for all over the summer, we want to have some kind of schedule, right? But you also want to have a schedule and be flexible with that schedule, right? You want to be able to change things around, but you don't want them, kids who normally go to bed at 7 o'clock staying up till midnight, right? So you want to have some kind of a schedule, some kind of rules, but you want to have flexibility in there as well. And really have a discussion and a dialogue on what do we as a family want our summer to look like, right? What are some things that we want to do? What are some things that we need to do? And then we think about our own mental health. It's not only about what we need, but how can we give to others? How can we support our community, our neighbors, our other family members? Because that also enhances our own mental health when we're not only kind of thinking about what we need, but what others need. And there's a lot of research on giving and gratitude and how that enhances mental health. And we know that the second pandemic is really associated with mental health. There are going to be a lot of mental health repercussions as a result of this health crisis, because so much has changed, and there's been a lot of grief associated by the loss of things that we used to do, the way things were, and we have to give ourselves space to process that, and our children need room and time to process that as well, because things are not the same, and this summer is not going to be the same as summers in the past, and we're going to have to do things differently, and we're going to need to process that as a family, to keep those discussions open, and to also find ways to enhance our own mental health, to build our resilience. And I think being in tune to our own self-care, but also providing support, finding times to be grateful about different things, are all part of enhancing that mental health efforts.
I agree. I mean, I think that a big part of what we need to do is to help contain this for ourselves and contain this for each other. And you obviously know a lot more about this than I do, and we know that there are a lot of resources. I mean, the mental health community has also really stepped up in an incredible way in terms of offering resources. But it's also, sometimes all you really need to do is to talk about something, and just having that conversation is going to make everybody feel better, and to make the whole situation feel a lot more contained. So again, yeah, I think we all, especially in sort of the Zoom world, we're all can feel very isolated and lonely. So if you're able to have those conversations with your family, I think you're going to have a much better time getting through the summer than if not.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts on media exposure over the summer? I know we've talked about it a little bit, but this is now the time when kids are going to say, well, I can't go to basketball camp, so I'm going to watch YouTube videos all summer, right? And so, I mean, I think that we still have to limit media exposure and find ways to be creative, right, over the summer.
I do, yeah, I agree. I mean, I do think that, because we're in the time that we're in right now, I think all human beings, no matter our age, are going to have this need of, let me just check out for a little bit. And video games, YouTube, media, these are ways that we check out. And I think it's important to be able to recognize that, maybe even schedule that into the daily routine, but you have to contain it. It has to be limited. So you can't just be on, playing video. You can't say, well, I don't want to be on Zoom sessions all day, but then instead be playing video games all day. Right. So yeah, I think a little bit of it is okay. I think maybe more than what we normally do is also okay, because we have to understand that we're living in a different time. But at the same time, it's also really important that we come up with structured ways, real ways of getting kids to do things in real life right now that they just we wouldn't normally have to do.
Right. And I think we have to be realistic as well, right? We have to abandon some of our kind of rigidity with respect to screen time, because particularly if you have a working parent who's now at home, you're not going to be able to spend the day doing creative art projects with your child all day when you also have to work, right? And so we have to be, again, show ourselves some grace and be flexible. And it's okay, like you were saying, if they have more screen time than they would normally have, because again, these are not normal times.
Right, and to come back to sort of what we said in the beginning, to try to frame it in the big picture. So if your child is getting extra exposure to screen time for a limited period of time, is that going to ruin their brain forever? No, it's not. It's going to be okay. Now, the hard part is going to be that transition back, right? Because if you begin to build certain habits, it's going to be really there's going to be a transition time to sort of go back to where we were. So we have to be mindful of that and don't let ourselves go too far off the edge. But yeah, generally speaking, even if this takes very long, like even if it takes a year, let's say, God forbid, let's hope not, but if it's still not going to make or break our lives. So keep that in mind, keep the big picture in mind, and hopefully, like you said, that will help you have some grace with yourself.
Absolutely. And again, it comes back to the idea of having some kind of structure, some kind of a schedule, but also be willing to be flexible. Because again, you're saying we eventually will have to transition back to school. And we don't want to make that transition more difficult by abandoning any sort of schedule or structure at all, right?
I will say this, I feel like we're gonna, after this, we're gonna love school so much. We're already like, oh my God, let me just go back to school. I don't think we'll be hearing them complain about having to go to school.
I know it. I know we talked a little bit about media exposure, and I think it's important to say too that, you know, we're in a world now where we are just bombarded by media. You know, our phones are pinging us and letting us know when there are updates and when the governor's speaking or when the mayor's speaking or when there's a White House briefing about the coronavirus. And I think we have to, as parents, as educators, have to limit our exposure to that information, because we have to recognize that the more exposure, and the research is very clear on this, the more we're exposed to that information, the more worry that we experience. And while worry is a good thing because it alerts us as human beings to danger, but when we're exposed to it persistently, it can be maladaptive and it can increase stress and undermine our mental health. And it's very hard to parent and to teach and to support our kids when our own mental health is compromised.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, a news diet, I think, is probably more important now than ever. It's something that we should all be practicing anyway, because, you know, our health is not just about what we put in our body or what we exercise. It has a lot to do with what's going on in our head. And so a media diet in general. I mean, even when you try to, and we have to be aware of this, even when you really are just trying to get the information. Like, so for example, when I read all the articles that are published in all the, you know, legitimate newspapers about what we're doing in the schooling situation, in every single one of them, there is this underlying anxious feeling in the writing. And the reason for that is that that's what sells. That's what's going to sell, you know, the paper. And so the more we read that, that's going to have an impact on us. I mean, that's part of being human. We mirror off each other. Anxiety is contagious. And so it's important that we limit. And then it's also important that every single time we read something, we're critical and remembering that this is not, you know, neutral data that we're looking at. This already went through a filter that is designed to create a little bit of anxiety in us. And so it's important to remember that and to help our children understand that as well. And then, you know, one of the things that I'm really have been asking both parents and to teach and children to try to engage in is a daily meditation practice. Even if it's just 1 to 2 minutes a day, just the act of trying to sit without anything from the outside coming in and just sitting with whatever this is on the inside. And you don't have to give it a big fancy name or anything like meditation or how do I do this. It's just a moment of silence. Yes. Or a few moments of silence throughout the day, I think can be hugely important, and a way for our intrinsic, because we're all resilient. It's built into our system. We all know kind of our higher truth and higher self and how to respond. It's how we're wired. But because we live in a time and a world where sometimes the voices out, well, not sometimes, usually the voices outside of us are so much louder, it's important that we take the time to just check in with our own voice inside. And you'd be surprised at how well you can or your children can sort things out for themselves when they give themselves the opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. I think that downtime is so important for our brains and for our overall well-being. We know that that's a great a practice for optimizing mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about when we, parents are worried, what do I do over the summer? I think that is something that you do. You take those 2 to 3 minutes to engage in that quiet, non-distraction free time for yourself. And I think other things that we can do is make sure that we're getting outside. We know that fresh air and we're getting and is helpful, and so is exercise. So there are 3 things that we can do that don't take a lot of time. We can get the sun on our face, we can get some exercise, and we can engage in these kind of short meditation, mindful practices. And all 3 of those enhance our mental health, can build resilience in all of us, and help us to be on the road to being ready for when things open up again.
Absolutely. And it's the small things. It's these tiny little small shifts that you make that create the really, really big changes. So it's not like you have to, go and become a Buddhist monk or something so that you can have, it's these tiny little things that you do. There's a few different free YouTube meditation challenges, like a 21-day meditation challenge where they teach kids how to meditate in 5-minute videos. Something really, really simple like that can add structure. It can get your kids learning and doing something that's really positive for them. And it can be very fun and challenging because it's a 21-day challenge. So tiny little things is what's really going to make the big differences.
Absolutely. This is great. This has been really great. And if there are no more questions, anything else that you'd like to say?
I think just generally speaking, we have to remember that we truly are in this together. And we are, I think we've already shown how incredible we are at supporting one another. This has in many ways restored my faith in humanity. And I think that at the end of the day, maybe it was a very needed thing. Of course, there's going to be repercussions. Of course, we're all worried about 1,001 different things. But to try to come back to the core of things and to remember to trust that probably all of this happened for a reason, and we're going to get through and we're going to be okay. I think reassuring ourselves and each other of that is ultimately what's going to get us through.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much for this discussion. It has been wonderful talking with you. It always is. And I hope that other people who were listening and watching benefited from the conversation that we have, and they can take some things and apply them in their own lives that will enhance the well-being of their child and their family in general. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And please, 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 people, feel free to reach out to us. We are here for you. We are here for you. So please do reach out if you need help.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Bye.